All right, hello. Welcome to the Ask Us Anything podcast.
What's up?
I'm Matt and Nathaniel. I'm on the production team here, and I am here with Pastor Nathaniel Lee.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. This week, Pastor Nathaniel preached on Genesis 1:26 through 1:31. And we didn't actually get any specific questions,
Which is very
but
surprising.
there are some areas that Nathaniel wanted to dive deeper into, and I had some questions. So I have some questions to which he's not prepared to answer.
It's true.
You may be prepared, but we'll find out.
Will the Spirit guide me?
Yes.
TBD.
Yeah. So
But I have no idea what he's going to ask.
he'll be in the hot seat,
So it's going to be fun.
and then we have some other questions. So let's dive into this here. The first question: why does our secular, self-created purposes not work?
It's a great question. I'm just kidding. I asked the
I
question. I actually did the
he wrote
grammar
that
wrong
question
there, too.
for everyone.
Why does
our secular, self-created purposes not work?
So
Okay.
fun fact, when I write, and I do the same thing when I talk,
Mm-hmm.
I'll think one thing and then I'll change my mind like in the middle of a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And it often makes the grammar wrong. So the original question I was going to ask was, why does our secular view not work on creating purpose? But then I changed it. So
Why do our secular, self-created purposes not work?
that's my grammar problem,
You just
not
wanted
yours.
me to look silly, so you wrote that down like that.
Exactly. It was a test.
Yeah.
All right.
Here we go.
This is something, these three questions that we're asking, they're really just they're selfish because these are three areas that I wanted to dive deeper into during the sermon. And it was already a long sermon. It was already just a whole lot of, ideas to develop. And so I just didn't have the time to do it. And so this is one of the things I really wanted to spend more time on. So why does our secular framework not work for creating purpose? Well, I think it doesn't work for a few reasons. One, I think our purpose needs to be given to us. It can't be discovered. It can't be manufactured by looking inward. And I don't know about you, Matt, but that's kind of the primary formula for finding a meaning that I see in our society.
Mm-hmm.
Like you do you, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
You look inward and you find yourself. And that sounds really awesome at first because in every Disney movie, it's like this hero or heroine throwing off the oppressive shackles of her parents' expectations or her cultural milieu or religious whatever, and they go find themselves. But I do think we often don't talk about how much of a burden it is to create your own meaning. Mm-hmm. And the real downside when you try to create your own meaning is when you start feeling anxious or depressed or exhausted, or you just actually figure out that you're not all that great. Your created meaning then becomes a demand upon yourself, a self-imposed demand that crushes you. Because if you think, I'm supposed to be an awesome worker, I'm supposed to be a unique, brilliant ray of sunshine, and then you kind of look in the mirror and you're like, I'm just a vanilla person. Mm-hmm. I dyed my hair a certain color, but everybody's dyeing their hair a certain color. I wore these cool, trendy outfit shoes, but everybody's wearing the cool. I'm rebelling against my parents, but everybody's rebelling against their parents. Mm-hmm. And then you begin to think like, can I create my own meaning? So I think it has to be given to us. Otherwise, it's dependent upon us in a way that I'm not sure that we can sustain. I'm not sure we were designed / we're made for, we're cut out for making our own meaning. Mm-hmm. All our internal sources are unreliable or they're changing. So what happens if your purpose is always changing? What if you wake up when you're 18 and you're like, I want my purpose to be to help the justice system give people that are, I'm trying to think of the word, wrongly, not acquitted. What's the opposite of acquitted? Convicted. Convicted of a crime. But then you get to 25 and you no longer want to do that. You switch your purpose. If you're always switching your purpose, that's kind of unsustainable and unreliable. So we need something that's given to us that is more stable than we are. Because I don't know about you, Matt, but I'm not a stable guy emotionally. I need something to anchor my soul. All right. So one, it needs to be given to us. Two, it needs to be given to us by someone powerful and really over history. Because If you just have, your boss give you a purpose, or you just have someone within a cultural context who's historically situated, then that purpose is going to expire.
Mm-hmm.
If a emperor, if a president, if a corporation, if even a societal movement, if the purpose is birthed within contingent purposes, then it will expire.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be given to you by someone who's all powerful. Otherwise, the world will eventually fade and your purpose will eventually go out. If you truly believe the end of the world is the universe contracting and exploding, the big crunch, the big slurp. You remember we talked about all those? Like,
The slurp.
there's 5 ways the world, according to just a purely scientific materialistic view, is going to end, and all of them will eradicate all of our purposes. Isn't that crazy? Every single thing we ever do
Mm-hmm.
will be eradicated. So it needs to be given by someone who's outside of time and history. It needs to matter. So it needs to be given to us. It needs to be given to us by someone powerful. And then third, it needs to be given to us by someone all loving, because you could have a giant demon running the cosmos and
Mm-hmm.
his purposes would be horrible. And then we should rebel, even if it is to our destruction. But what scripture says is that it's given to us by someone who's all loving. It needs to be doable, and it needs to be for the flourishing. And we know that God enters into our existence. That's the greatest act of love ever. And he dies for us, but then he gives us a purpose. And because the one who is giving us our purpose is loving us, so God comes to us, Matt, and he doesn't say, Matt, I need you to go and make disciples in order for me to love you. He comes and he says, I've given you every single thing ever in myself. How will he not give us all things if he's given us his son, Paul says in Romans 8.
Mm-hmm.
He's given us everything, and he loves us. And there's nothing that you can ever do, Matt, and there's nothing I can ever do to make God love us anymore. And there's nothing that we can do to make us or make him love us any less. Then any purpose we have is a response to that love, not to earn that love. And that's the only sustainable purpose, because unless it's given to us by someone all powerful and someone all loving, any purpose we have is going to be try to get that love. Mm-hmm. It's going to crush us. There's no amount of work that you can ever do, Matt, that I can ever do, that is going to make us feel loved fully and known truly. Nothing. We're going to keep moving from thing to thing until it crushes us. And the last thing, or 2 other things, I guess 4 and 5, is that our purpose needs to account for the way things are. If you have a purpose in the world that doesn't account for evil, you're going to get burnt out really quick. So if you say we can build a just society and we can actually eradicate racism once and for all,
Mm-hmm.
or we can eradicate poverty once and for all, you're going to get really discouraged by, running into some really messed up people, because the world is just, I think, always going to be, jacked up. However, if you don't have a view of the world that it's created good, you're never going to want to try to change things.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? You got to have a view of the world as created and fallen.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, our secular purposes won't work, because our world does not, our secular framework does not give us a framework that should tell us to pursue justice.
Mm-hmm.
If you're here by accident and I'm here by accident, and survival of the fittest is really the way of the world, it's the rhythm of the universe, then it makes no sense for me to try to fight against it. It makes no sense for me to try to stand up for minorities. It makes no sense for me to try to, advocate for people who are financially in need. It makes no sense for me to do anything or give a rat's butt about anybody else in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the grain of the universe, survival of the fittest. But if you know that the world is created, there's a goodness to the world that we lost, and the Lord's coming to redeem it. I need to work towards that. And because of Christ's redemption, I am empowered to do that. But then it's fallen. There is evil in this world. Your purposes are going to be crushed. Mm-hmm. You got to have that creation, fall, redemption, consummation framework to situate your purposes. Otherwise, you're not going to be motivated to do anything, or you're going to be utterly discouraged when you come up against obstacles. It needs to have deep perspectives of evil and hope. That's why.
Sure. Can I ask a follow-up based on that?
Absolutely. I have this long quote, but I don't know if it's worth reading, but please ask a follow-up.
I think you want to do it. You want to just do the
quote. Do I want to do the quote?
Let's do the quote.
All right, so here's a good example from a secular person, I think, that really shows the emptiness of a secular view. He says this. It was I Googled what's the meaning of life, and this came up on Quora. How do I, and he was just basically saying
This
there
is
is
great.
nothing. He says, how do I escape this endless suffering prison called existence? It's actually much longer than this, and I cut it down. I don't feel like life is a gift like most people say. I won't feed you the same false generic platitudes everyone else does. It's a self-preservation mechanism to run from the truth because they know instinctively the only other option would be to face exactly the same dilemma you are now. Instead, they go to counseling, they take drugs, they drink, they have sex, they chase money and material things, and they indulge themselves in other coping mechanisms that offer temporary pleasure, but they distract themselves from thinking, or I'm sorry, these things distract them from thinking about anything other than the real issues. They ignore suffering in the world and all around them, but will be quick to virtue signal as if they are doing anything productive to reduce it or help. We are on a chunk of rock hurtling through space with a bunch of creatures on it fighting and killing each other so they can eat each other alive. We have all types of bacteria, viruses, diseases, illnesses of the most nightmarish sort. We have babies born with all sorts of deformities and handicaps and elderly people with brains that shrivel up while they lose hearing, eyesight, and lose control over bodily functions. Isn't this a depressing quote?
Mm-hmm.
We have billions of homeless and starving. We have droughts and famines. And he goes on and on and on. He says, we say life can be whatever you make it, and you can give any meaning you want. How lame is this? Actually, you can't. You see, there's a thing called reality that gets in the way. And he goes on. I'm not going to keep reading the quote. He basically says, don't procreate because you're going to perpetuate this problem. The best thing you can do is cope via drugs and whatever you need to do. Mm-hmm. Do what makes you happy. Don't get in relationships, and just basically survive.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I'm not making fun of what he says. I think if you don't believe in the purpose that we talked about on Sunday, this is the thing that, in my opinion, makes the most sense.
Yeah, it sounds like an honest, thoughtful, secular perspective.
Yeah.
If you have a worldview that's not a biblical worldview, inclusive of the fall and everything,
absolutely,
then this is what people say should be the conclusions you draw. Oh,
that was impressive. For those of you listening, I just caught something. For those of you watching, only real ones know. Yeah, I found it very convicting. But I say all that. I quote the quote again to say, I think the purpose we're given in the cultural mandate, it has to be given to us. Mm-hmm. He assumes that nothing is given to us. It has to be from someone all-powerful. He assumes that there is no one outside of time, and that if there is, he's not loving. And it has to account for the goodness and fallenness, which, again, all the fallen things he mentioned, I think the biblical view of the fall accounts for. But then it shows how we can fight against it in a way that is realistic. Because the biblical view of the cultural mandate is not that we accomplish it. Jesus accomplishes it. We live in response to that. And then he's going to finish the job at his return.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I think it's interesting. I had written something down on this, but I decided I couldn't get a question out of it. And I have more of a comment. I don't know if you've seen this at all, but I didn't expect to meet so many people in my lifetime who get married and whatnot, and just off the bat, they're like, oh, we're not going to have kids. Both Christians and non-Christians actually, that have said, no, like that's not part of our plan. We don't want to do that. Not to be stereotypical, but like generally these are like New Yorkers or things like that, right? Have you seen that? And just what are your thoughts on that?
It's a really, really great question. And I'm glad you asked it because that's something I wanted to dive deeper into, but maybe out of fear didn't. Mm-hmm. I think, I think it makes sense. And I don't mean that in a good way. It makes sense for secular people. Yeah. I'll hopefully say, I don't think it makes sense for disciples of Jesus. Mm-hmm. It makes sense for secular people because if, as this guy said, I kind of cut out, the last part for the sake of time. But he kind of goes on, don't procreate because we're going to bring people into this misery. Yeah. The most responsible, virtuous thing we can do is not to have kids, which the reason why I was going to quote on Sunday, but again, for the sake of time, didn't, was because I was going to contrast it to the cultural mandate, which commands be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. But if your view is that the world might end, why would we have kids? Mm-hmm. And then also if your view is, what sociologists have called expressive individualism, which is basically like, I need to live my truth, and I want to be kind to everyone, but my life is primarily about me.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I need to seek the general flourishing of all people, but at the end of the day, I need to do what makes me happy. Why would you have kids?
Yeah.
Because if your primary goal is your own personal comfort and happiness, kids don't help with that.
Mm-hmm.
If your primary identity is expressing yourself,
Mm-hmm.
a baby does not care about your expressive individualism, as we can both attest to, right? It doesn't, like, if your main goal in life is, I need to get a whole bunch of sleep so that I can be the best me tomorrow, your baby's like, yeah, I don't care.
I think it's similar to marriage in that sense.
Oh, absolutely.
If your sole thought process is what best serves myself in terms of comfort and these things, then there's no reason to get married.
Yep.
Getting marriage and children should be two of kind of the most selfless endeavors you enter into,
Yeah.
right?
You die
And
to self a lot.
yeah, and if you're entering into those things thinking, oh, these things will serve me, you're in for a tough time, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you're a secular person, again, don't hear this as judgment, but their worldview produces the action.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some business guy that said something. Every system is designed to give you the exact results you're given, or he said it much more epically than that. But I think he's right. I mean, he's talking about management systems, but if you have an expressive individualistic worldview, then you're not going to have kids. You probably won't get married. That's what we're seeing in society.
Yeah.
The reason why birth rates are lower than marriage rates, which both of them,
Mm-hmm.
to the best of, I know birth rates are dropping. I assume marriage rates are also dropping.
We're talking about in the U.S.
In the U.S.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good clarification.
Yeah.
Not happening around the world. In fact, the birth rate's going up around the world. You can't divorce a 3-year-old, right? You can divorce your husband if you don't feel fulfilled.
Yeah.
If you have a 5-year-old, it's not yet, hopefully forever, it's not yet societally acceptable in most instances to where if your 10-year-old's bothering you enough, you're like, you know what?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want you anymore.
Yeah.
Have fun. Now, again, I know the foster care system is really complicated,
Mm-hmm.
and there's certain parents who may not have the ability. I'm not talking about that right
Sure.
now. I'm talking about people, maybe a rich New York family that's like,
this is inconvenient.
I really don't want this 10-year-old anymore. Like, it's not acceptable. It is acceptable with marriage, meaning societally acceptable, not biblically acceptable. That if you're like, you know what, my spouse, it just really isn't doing it for me. Bye. But yeah, you're right. People aren't getting married because it's like it's a lot easier to break up with your girlfriend or your boyfriend than it is to divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Although sadly, it's not that much more difficult to divorce than it is with no fault divorce. So now let's talk about Christians. I think the problem with Christians is they've adopted an expressive individualistic mindset more than a biblical mindset. That's why we always use the category of social imaginary. It sounds all like, ooh, mysterious, rather than worldview. I don't have any like problems with worldview. I just think it's incomplete. And Charles Taylor's category of there's a water that we're swimming in that's much more subtle. And I think a lot of Christians have bought into the idea that the chief end of my life is I want to be happy and I want to do what's best for me. And I love Jesus too, but Jesus wants what's best for me. That's not true. It is true, but it's not true.
Mm-hmm.
It's true in the sense that Jesus does want your flourishing. It's not true in the sense that your definition of flourishing, let me put it this way, the expressive individualistic definition of flourishing is not Jesus' definition. And I think that's a good thing, because if the expressive individualistic definition of flourishing was a good thing, then our society would be the happiest society ever. We're not. We're not even. I think I was watching Rainn Wilson's, I don't know if you've heard of this little show on Peacock. He's searching for happiness, and I think they said that the U.S. has never cracked the top 10 in happiest countries. Yet we have the highest GDP.
Mm-hmm.
We're the most individualistic country in the world, so we should be the happiest if expressive individualism is the way to happiness, but it's not. And so we've adopted as a society, as a church, not our church, but a lot of people in the church, but everyone's guilty of this. Jesus wants my truth to be lived out, my happiness, my freedom from restrictions. And therefore, if I think kids aren't, a way to make me happy, then I'm not going to have kids. And you're like, but this command to be fruitful and multiply is still a command. Mm-hmm. Again, there's lots of reasons why many people can't have kids. Many people want to be married but can't. Many people who are married are trying to have kids, and for whatever reason, biological, all these different reasons, they can't. And we're going to talk much more about that in the fall. Exactly. Yeah. But we're talking about the very specific instance, at least what I hear you talking about is, we biologically can, we're choosing not to. And I was thinking a lot about this last week, and I maybe I'm wrong here, but I don't see how you can square that with the cultural mandate. I understand the difficulty of having children, and I don't yet understand the full difficulty of having children. Mm-hmm. We only have one kid. But we're already talking about man, it's going to be hard to have more financially, emotionally, spiritually. Nobody is saying that it's an easy thing. Yeah. Right. Nobody is going to say, any parent is not going to say it's an easy thing, but it's worthwhile. It makes you into someone that is truly more like Jesus. It's a sanctifying process.
Sure.
It has a much more rich view of joy than I think expressive individualism does. But we're not meant to have kids for us. We're meant to have kids for the flourishing of the world. Mm-hmm. And that even is different a parenting philosophy than our society, which is let's coddle our kids. Let's make sure they feel safe. Let's make sure that they're happy. Bible doesn't say that. It says you need to raise your kids in the fear of the Lord so they can fight evil. You're to love them. You're to cherish them. But sometimes you let bad things happen to your kids. Sometimes you let hard things happen to your kids because you care more about them becoming more like Jesus than you do about them being comfortable. Mm-hmm. And sometimes being comfortable and being more like Jesus are mutually exclusive things. Mm-hmm. Dying to self. So really, I would say to those people, how does that philosophy fit with Jesus's call to die to self, but then to be fruitful and multiply? Mm-hmm. But yeah, of course it's difficult to have kids.
Let me ask a follow-up on this, which I hinted to you before we entered the room, that this was something that just popped into my brain. You're saying that, and I agree with you, that it's tough to square the cultural mandate with the concept of, with the idea of not having kids or deciding to not have children.
Absolutely. I reserve the right to be wrong and get smarter, but as far as I can tell.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. Yep. And I'm sure if you were to ask everyone, there's probably a wide range of reasons that they would give you as to why they've decided not to have kids. They probably aren't all sitting there with the same reasoning.
Sure.
And I just thought of one, for instance. I know a couple that they have. She has cystic fibrosis, and they ended up actually adopting. But she was really concerned, it was a question with her and her husband, is this ethical for me to bring a child in knowing that this child will likely have cystic fibrosis and all these things? And that's a whole nother question and things like that. My question for you is actually about contraceptives.
Let's do it.
Can we square using contraceptives to limit children? Because I think, isn't it within, correct me if I'm wrong, but within the Catholic Church, yep. I know at least that's, they wouldn't ever use contraceptives, and that's why there's the classic picture or the classic idea of seeing a Catholic family and they have 15 kids. Can we square that? I don't know. I know I didn't prepare you for this. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, it's a really good question. And I will say it is something that we should talk way more about. So just a fun little story to intro this. I was taking a class on contemporary Catholic theology in college, which was basically, we just read through the documents of the Council of Vatican II in the 60s.
Sounds thrilling.
Oh, it was so hype. I was like, I almost became Catholic. If you're in the Presbyterian and you're watching this, don't worry. I affirm the Westminster Confession of Faith. But there was a moment in my senior year of college where I was like, man, my whole life I'd caricatured the Catholic Church as a bunch of people who didn't read the Bible and they were just stuck up with tradition. And I was like, no, they've really thought through these things. And especially social, what am I blanking on the way they put it? Catholic social teaching.
Sure.
Oh my goodness, it's so rich. And I think it's Humane Vitae. I'm probably butchering the Latin there because, Catholics, you have to do Latin titles for everything. They talk about contraception. And I was mostly convinced by their argument. And I had just gotten engaged like to Brenna. That it was that week. And I was like, Brenna, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if, because, yeah. Well, as engaged couples, maybe this is TMI. I didn't think about this before. So
Sure.
Engaged couples are beginning to talk about birth control options. And I was like, I don't know, Brenna. Like, I think the Catholics are right. And so it was a funny little, I don't think Brenna ever listens to these anyway, so she won't know I'm talking about this. But yeah, I was really, the reason why I did the story is I have not ever fully resolved the tension I felt there.
Interesting.
I have a lot of personal reasons, and I could go into details that probably wouldn't be okay to share on the internet. Personal objections to various forms of contraceptives.
Yeah.
Mostly
that's
that
kind of a different topic.
Right. That alter a woman's body. But maybe that's not the specifics of the question. However, I do think they touch on the tangentially touch on this idea in Genesis 1 that the Catholics get at, and it's getting to your question. If we're going to say that the biblical view of marriage is based on Genesis 1, and in Genesis 1, it's one man and one woman, and the way that children are brought into the world is through, two people having intercourse, and that you can't divorce any of those aspects from one another. The Catholic argument, which I'm pretty much convinced by, is that they're basically taking what evangelicals have and taking it to the logical extension. The evangelicals basically just stop with a one man, one woman marriage thing. Like, it has to be monogamous, one man, one woman. That's it. The Catholics are saying, well, no. If you like prevent that possibility via any kind of contraceptive, aren't you technically doing one stage short of abortion? And it's a really long argument, and I don't have the time to summarize it. But the argument essentially goes, contraceptives lower the value of sex because they make sex a transaction. And they said there's something, because again, the pill was just coming out, if I'm not mistaken, in the 60s. Maybe it was before that. I don't remember.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, I'm blank. But I know it's within the 20th century. When you basically introduce contraceptives, you make a possibility for what we were just talking about. You can choose not to have kids. That really wasn't an option in the 1800s. Like, yeah, I mean, like, you're risking it every single time, right? And they basically said, I pulled up a quote here. I heard you were going to ask about contraceptives, so I looked up, I wanted his quote. And so I just briefly looked this up, and it was from some pope. I don't remember if it was John or would it be JP2 or Benedict? I think it would be JP2, John the Paul II. Which JP2 just sounds so cool. A man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman.
Say that again.
A man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman. And what he was getting at, and I think it's totally true, is that when you begin to divorce sex from childbearing, which contraceptives give us the ability to do, you can objectify women a lot more. You don't have one night stands as much if there's a potential for pregnancy, and the possibility of abortion is very before the 20th century dangerous.
Sure.
Right? And even among secular people, the Catholic Church would say that reduces rape, that reduces out of wedlock childbirth, or they're kind of pushing back against the common argument today. Like, well, if we have, condoms in all the schools, then, unwanted pregnancies are going to go down. The Catholic Church would say if you get rid of all contraceptives, then unwanted pregnancies will go down because people won't have sex to begin with because they'll all be terrified to have a kid. And anyway, their whole thing was basically saying this technological possibility has led us to objectifying people, to view them only as sex. Before contraceptives, you can't view a woman as a man only as an object of sexual appetite, because you're always thinking, oh shoot, a kid could come out of this. And so they said, what's going to happen as a society if we keep doing this, writing this in the 60s, think of all the things that are happening in the 60s, is we're going to treat sex as just another activity. And that's exactly what's happened. They were right. They're totally right. Now to the ethic, the question beneath all the question. I'm not going to give you a firm answer because I'm honestly not sure. I think my Protestant self is wanting to say, nope, you can use whatever contraceptive methods you want if you're married. But I can't biblically justify that. And the thing that really opened my eyes to this was looking at earlier Protestant views. Like I'm talking like pre-1960 Protestant views. They all, to the best of my memory, objected to contraceptive methods.
Interesting.
I don't quote me on that because it's been like 7 or 8 years since I've looked into this when I was going through my existential crisis with to kind of threw a monkey wrench in
Sure.
my engagement. Because as a 21 and 20-year-old who could not have afforded to have kids back then. But yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. I'm not confident enough to say contraceptive methods are intrinsically sin, but I'm also not confident enough to say you shouldn't think about it. Because, again, the Catholics, just to clarify, the Catholics are totally open to natural family planning.
Yeah.
And I don't even know, trying not to get too personal on the podcast, but I think that works. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
And again, to read Humane Vitae, I think it is, but they talk a lot more about that. But I think it's something that Protestants should really think much more about. The Catholics have thought a lot about it. And I think our sexual ethic could really be enriched by learning from our Catholic brothers and sisters because they have a higher view of sex than we do. They have a much more robust view of sex than we do. And I think they want to show the intrinsic connection between the possibility of having a child and the sexual act.
Yeah.
And they think most Protestants and definitely secular people have divorced those two, and it's led to the dehumanization of specifically women, but generally sex.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. And I had kind of felt that way after your sermon this week, just listening to the sermon, and you weren't preaching on that, right? Like you weren't trying to address that.
I wanted to more though, so I'm glad that you felt that impression.
But it naturally, just talking about the cultural mandate and those things, it made me think about those things and naturally, because I think those are kind of some of the conclusions you would draw. And
Can I add one more thing on that too? You were about to say something. Go ahead and finish.
No, go ahead.
This is a little feisty. I'll speak for myself. My hesitancy to have a bunch of kids and our hesitancy to have kids before we did was based on our idolatry. My idolatry is financial security. I don't really want to get enough money to go buy a bunch of nice things. I like nice things. I want to get enough money to where I know that I may not ever become in true need. And you know what's really challenging to financial security? Our children. And we both were full-time students until a couple of years ago. And so we knew like, oh man, if we have a kid, like, and so I'm not saying like waiting to have kids for financial reasons is intrinsically wrong, but really examine your soul. Why?
What's motivating it?
Yeah. Like, I don't think everyone should have 10 kids. I do think, and I've checked my heart on this, so maybe I'm wrong. I think everyone should have as many kids as they can. Not biologically, but financially, biologically. And we're not going to tell you like you got to have at least 5 kids. But I do think like if you're stopping like, or if you don't want to have kids or you want to only have one kid and your only reason is we really want to be able to take our kid on a super nice vacation and we really want to be able to drive a Range Rover and send them to a 4-year school. Again, I know there are certain people that having 1 or 2 kids is all they can possibly do for emotional health reasons. And there is no shame or condemnation. This is just personal preference, or not preference, but even it's just really ask a tough question. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying have a bunch of kids. I'm not saying, you're living in sin if you don't have a bunch of kids. I'm just saying if your main reasons are really, here's what I'm saying. Ask yourself what your main reasons are for not wanting to have more kids.
Definitely.
That's it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And children are a blessing. What is it? Psalm 121? The more kids, the merrier. Do we believe that or do we not?
Yeah.
I struggle to believe that. I only want to have like 3 or 4, but I'm like, should we have more? Like,
Well,
um,
even before you said, and we couldn't afford, what is that question? We couldn't afford. Like, what do you mean by that when you
exactly.
say that to yourself? Because
Totally.
almost anyone could say to themselves, I can't afford children. But what does that mean? Oh, I would have to make too many compromises in my lifestyle to be able to
Right.
afford them. What really does that mean?
Yeah. It means
Um,
that you're going to have to get uncomfortable and you're going to
yeah,
have to trust the Lord.
yeah, yeah. Okay, moving on here. How would our lives look differently if we lived in light of the cultural mandate?
Well, I think we've been talking about a lot of them.
Yeah, I know.
The second one, uh, but let me just, so let me just say this. We clearly don't understand the relevance of the cultural mandate in our life. I saw a poll from NPR published a couple weeks ago that said religion is less important in the lives of Americans. And the statistic that was shocking to me is that according to them, around 40% of evangelical, I know that's a ambiguous term, evangelical Christians say that religion is the most important reality in their lives. Every other group is lower than that. So on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, it makes sense that
Yeah.
I think the two categories that were the most important were black Protestants and white evangelicals. But I think the thing that was surprising was 40%. That's it. Like only 40%. There are more people that say that their relationship with Jesus is less important than some other aspect in their life. And I think it's because, excuse me, I think it's because a lot of people are like, yeah, I love Jesus. I believe in, the resurrection, but the devil has done a good job of of helping us forget how that has any practical impact on our lives. I think a lot of those evangelicals, black Protestants, whatever the categories were, I'm blanking, they believe in all of these things, but a lot of people evidently are like, I don't see how that has cultural import
Mhm.
on my day-to-day life. And I think the cultural mandate is the perfect way to see that. So just again, 3 things. We'll go through each of the 3 things. I won't talk about the second one as much because we just talked about a lot. One, we fail to see the blessing we try to gain through our work. So we constantly need to ask, why am I doing what I'm doing? And I think the cultural mandate really shows that you already have a blessing. You already have love. You already have an identity. You already have a purpose, which we just spent like 20 minutes talking about. And that changes the fundamental purpose of everything you do. So what kind of impact does it have on your life? Every impact, right? So your motivation changes for everything because you're no longer trying to work for all these things. You're working from it. And think about how different that would change an exhausting day. If you're going through your exhausting day and you're doing it for your family or your spouse and you're doing it to love them, a grueling day at work, that's so much more impactful than if I were to tell you, Matt, I want you to roll this heavy ball up the hill, to reference the Sisyphus myth, but then it's going to roll back down. How are you going to be doing that? There's not going to be a single bit of joy in your heart at all, contrary to what Albert Camus says. Like, Sisyphus must have joy. No, why would he have joy? Like, there's no purpose to what he's doing. But if you know that if you roll up that ball to the top of the hill, I'm going to give you and your family a brand new house, and you're going to be able to eat. And you're going to do that with so much joy. And so if we know that we're doing all that we're doing for God's glory, because we've already been loved for him, changes every purpose that we do. It gives us energy. It gives us joy and hope. Fruitful multiply, we just talked about a bunch of things, but non-family related, if you're single and you're like, the family stuff has no impact for me. Well, I think it does. You're always thinking outside of your community as a single person. You're always, wanting to push the boundaries of community and not always be safe and comfortable. If you're wanting to keep the status quo, it's often, a desire to be self-sufficient. When you go outside your comfort zone, you need other people. And so when we're called to be fruitful and multiply, we're called to go outside of our comfort zone.
Real quick.
Yes.
On the fruitful and multiply, in the sermon, did you say that isn't simply addressing procreating and having kids? Like,
Oh, absolutely.
it's also applying to other areas.
Jesus expanded it.
Sure.
He didn't. No, what people miss is he didn't abrogate. Jesus rarely abrogates things. He rarely gets rid of things.
Yeah.
He clarifies, like teaching about divorce or teaching about lust or whatever, like we just talked about in the Sermon on the Mount. he will fulfill. So food codes, clothing codes, basically all the sacrifices and purity, because he fulfills it. He doesn't get rid of it.
Yeah.
He doesn't look back at Leviticus and be like, oh, they shouldn't have done that. He said that pointed to me and I fulfilled it and I've made it all effectual. Or he adds to it. And I think, and I'm not even sure this is something he brand new adds. Like I do think the people of Abraham were called to be a blessing so that they could, or they were blessed so that they could be a blessing. And he's just basically, so I guess he is fulfilling it, not really adding. He's fulfilling like, okay, now go and make and multiply disciples. That's our mission statement, right? So families are also called to do that. It's not like families, have a bunch of kids and then the single people go out and do all the evangelism. Everyone's called to do evangelism. But I do think there is a benefit, which I alluded to, of being single, that you do have more time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know a single person might be offended by me saying that, but I thought I was busy when I was single. I'm sure you probably thought the same thing.
Sure.
And there's nothing wrong with being single, but I guess what I'm saying is like you have this unique opportunity to multiply in a way that maybe a family is not excused from, but maybe I'm quoting 1 Corinthians 7, they have other responsibilities but I do think families have the responsibility of inviting single people in a way that, single people maybe don't, vice versa. And so, yes, it definitely does. We are constantly called to seek the good of others. Jeremiah 29, which read, seek the shalom, the welfare of the city. We're constantly called to be evangelizing, actively doing apologetics, not necessarily just trying to prove the faith, but even just to try to lovingly challenge our secular neighbors, always outward facing. It's so much more comfortable to be insular. I struggle with this. I'm very, insular in my thinking. But when I look at the loving triune God who created not because he needed something and was not insular, that's the motivation to be fruitful and multiply. And then subduing is, did I answer your question, by the way?
Yeah, you did.
Okay. And then subduing, I think, is, you know what? Give me an example of a vocation, and then I'll try to apply it to subduing.
Plumber.
This is a great example because a lot of people that push back against the relevance of the cultural mandate say there's no Christian way to be a plumber. There absolutely is a Christian way to be a plumber. We have, I don't want to put them, I don't want to.
I actually know multiple Christian plumbers, by the way.
Like we have, many of you might know who I'm talking about. We have a great, there's two Christian guys in our church that have a construction company, and I'm not going to mention their name because I don't want a bunch of people to reach out and be like, oh, help me. But I called them not to get a free job. I paid for it, but I knew that they would do a good job. Mm-hmm. And Martin Luther has this quote somewhere. He basically the Christian way to do a job is you do it to the best of your ability and you charge a fair price. So the Christian way to be a plumber is I'm spitballing here. Is there a Christian way to wipe a toilet? I think in some ways, yes. You're not just trying to get out of there as quickly as possible. You're trying to say, I'm making order out of chaos. Maybe plumbing is the best way to say, maybe that's the most vivid example of when you call a plumber, there's chaos and the plumber's coming in and they're bringing order. So the actual action is a Christian thing. Not that, non-Christians can't bring order out of chaos, but they're both doing it. But then there's a legitimate treating of the human being as the best possible way. You're not a doormat, but you're saying, hey, I'm going to charge you a fair price. I'm not going to gyp you. I'm going to come when I can. I'm not going to say, I'll be there sometime in the next 2 weeks. You don't use the consumer, even though theoretically you could. I mean, right? From what I've heard, there's a lot of power among contractors today. It's the market's changed or whatever. That could be wrong, but I'm just going off what I've heard. But you say, I'm going to do the best of my job. I'm going to ask the person how they're doing. I'm going to not waste time or whatever, but I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. I'm not going to set it up to where they might have to need to call me back. And I might even check back in. And so you're doing it to the best of your ability. You're treating people as the image of God. And maybe this sounds hyper spiritual and random. You're praying for the person as you're doing it. You're praying, Lord Jesus, help me have a conversation with you. Help even the work ethic that I'm doing right now. They're so amazed that they say, wow, that's amazing. And you might even be able to throw in a remark. Yeah, I'm glad that this is the case. And I want to do this for the glory of God. That's the motivation and whatnot. Mm-hmm. Again, there's probably more, but every single job can be done to the glory of God in a way that is subduing the earth.
Yeah.
That's not to say secular people can't subdue the earth. It's just to say that I think the scriptures give us a unique insight on how to do it. But by God's common grace, yeah, secular people can do that too. It's just to say that sometimes Christians don't, and we should.
Yeah.
So that's how I think the cultural mandate imports on our lives practically.
No, that's great. Well, actually, I was thinking about it too in terms of having influence or evangelism or things like that. I'm thinking about when we were doing essentially, it wasn't new construction, but we did a complete renovation. I had some Christian plumbers who were in there, and these guys were blasting worship music as they work. But the thing with something like a plumber, they're often working with other contractors as well,
Yeah.
right? So
That's a good point.
there's all these other craftsmen in there. There's carpenters, there's electricians that they're interacting with, and they're seeing how they go about their job,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah, and
having
that
influence
contractor
there.
may be like having a horrible day, and even just saying like, brother, like, how are you doing?
Sure.
They may not have had anybody ask how they're doing in like weeks.
Yeah.
You just hear of all these suicides all the time, and you're like, how many suicides could have been? I don't want to degrade mental health here, but I'm just saying, how many suicides could have been avoided with just normal, common day kindness from someone else? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just, it breaks my heart. And I'm not saying like if you say hi, you're going to prevent someone's suicide. But what I'm saying is like, a good question to ask yourself if you're a plumber or you're a parent or you're working as a teacher is, where do I see the work of the fall and the work of the devil and the work of sin right now? And I got to fight it. And last comment I'll make on this, because I know we're pushing time here, but like, I can't tell you, Matt, how many times I hear, and maybe you felt this, just a discouragement among Christians with their vocation. To be honest, like I felt it as a pastor a lot. I feel it all the time. And I think some people look at me and they're like, wow, you're doing something that matters. And I'm like, that doesn't stop me from waking up in the morning feeling like everything I do is utterly pointless.
Yeah.
Every Christian, every, non-Christian, definitely, everyone feels that at some point. I think this view of the cultural mandate, if to the degree let me put it this way, to the degree we understand the cultural mandate, we will see significance in our work. We will never go through a day saying, I just got to get by. I mean, I'm not saying we never do that. I'm just saying we shouldn't do that. Like, we were always fighting the work of the devil every day. There is no, let me put it this way, there's no task too mundane that it cannot glorify God and be an all-out assault on the kingdom of darkness. There's nothing. And I think the Lord dignifies work when he says subdue it. And so again, that's not to the detriment of making disciples and evangelism and preaching, but it's also saying when you go about your 9 to 5, Matt, or whoever's listening to this, my goodness, your work is fighting the work of the devil. And the devil, if I were the devil, the thing I would be most keen on is, let me try to get Christians to not see their 9 to 5 jobs, their parenting, their normal mundane lives as significant. But the devil sees it as significant. Otherwise, he wouldn't be, out attacking it. And I remember, for me personally, I think this even clicked. I mentioned this in a sermon 3 weeks ago. I was getting discouraged with, I'm like, people are like, just, no one really cares, whatever. And I heard a preacher, John Mark Comer, say, we need to remember that we're preaching to the powers and principalities. Even if there's not a single person in the congregation that's paying attention to anything that I'm saying, I need to realize that room right over there is filled with demons. And it's like, I get people like, oh, this is the Pentecostal night command. And it's like every single person has multiple spiritual attacks every day. And I'm preaching to them. I'm like, the demons need to know that you are not king. There is a kingdom that is coming down. And if anything, that's what we're doing when we're praying. We're proclaiming to the angels, the powers. We're joining. Anyway, all that. I'm getting carried away.
Okay.
But we need to have an eschatological perspective of our everyday moment. Anyway. so much impact.
Yeah. Justice. Do you want to do justice, or is this going to be too long and you want to save it for another week? You want to do it now?
Let's do it real quick. And then if people have follow-up questions, they can ask. I think we can do this quick.
Justice. Within the church, outside of the church, everyone's kind of up in arms about social justice and those things. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. So again, like, as you kind of said, like we were talking before, and a lot of people are either like, you think that social justice is like one of the only things they ever do.
Yeah.
By like the signs on their church building. You're like, do you guys worship Jesus, or is this like a social organization? In other churches, they act like doing justice is like heresy. And so it's like, why? And to be honest, I don't. Let me put it this way: I kind of understand like why people are so up in arms, but I don't think it's a reasonable thing to be up in arms about on either side.
The
Uh,
two sides being one is a hyper focus on social justice, and the other saying that
right.
we're missing what we should be focusing on by focusing on social justice.
Exactly. And so, a 30-second history. A lot of it stems down to history, meaning that there were groups of mostly Protestants, early 20th century, and even going back, that were really about religion is only about emotions and feelings and doing justice. And they did a lot of the justice. And then a lot of other Protestants were basically like, no, it's about the substitutionary atonement of Christ in the Bible. And for whatever reason, it's super complex history. They formed two camps. And so I think this idea became ingrained. Again, it's much more complicated than what I'm making it out to be, but that was the general movement. It became ingrained that if you are about justice, you're a heretic. And if you are about the cross and the high view of Scripture, you don't do justice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people that were about the cross were like, oh, we're not going to fight Jim Crow. And that was a problem. The foundation of the PCA has a lot of problems. For Continuing Church by Sean Lucas is a great book on that. Where a lot of people had good theological reasons, but they're also like maybe seeking towards segregation. And you're like, whoa, how do those two things? How do you have such solid theology and yet crappy implications for life?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, how do you go through to the other side of the camp? How do you have people that are like, Black Lives Matter, we need to fight for the poor, all of which are true, and yet ignore Jesus' teaching on hell?
Mm-hmm.
Like how it's the work of the devil, man. If I were the devil, I would try to split those two things up.
Mm-hmm.
And you just get people so mad at other Christians. Because a lot of people that are super passionate about doctrine are just angry. They end up being angry at liberals for not believing the truth. And they don't even think, oh, I need to be preaching to non-believers. And they're so mad at liberal Christians. And then liberal Christians are so up in arms about conservative Christians that they're like, oh, let's all do justice. And let's basically virtue signal to the other Christians who are not doing justice. And it's like, you're not even doing justice. Like very often, I had a friend who's in the city. He said, the churches that have the Black Lives Matter signs on their churches are often ones that are full of rich white people. They're not actually doing justice. And it's because the only churches, in my opinion, that really do justice long term and really are churches that really teach the gospel. And churches that really, really teach the full gospel are ones that do justice. You can't divorce them.
Yeah.
Okay, so now how do they practically get worked out? That's the more complicated question. I think both churches are built on a reasonable fear. I think the social justice crew is built on a fear that we're going to quarantine our doctrine from our other aspects of life, which hopefully, as we've spent a lot of time talking about, you shouldn't do that. The other Christians, the evangelical Christians, I'll call them, even though let's say that maybe this certain group of evangelicals who are anti-social justice are very concerned that the centrality of the gospel is going to get laid aside. And it's a reasonable fear because it has. So how do you balance those two things? I think, again, it's actually more simple than we make it out to be. The practice of it's tough. The idea is simple. We need to say that Jesus primarily came to reconcile us to God. So the evangelicals are right in that sense, that the gospel is primarily what God has done to save us in Christ. The primary, and that's addressing the primary aspect of the fall, is that we made something else Lord over our lives other than God. We trusted in ourselves rather than God. We all have idols, yada, yada, yada. So that's what sin fundamentally is. And Jesus came to do that. Now, here's where I would say that's a truncated gospel, is we shouldn't stop there. That is the thing. That is the gospel. But we need to say, okay, how does the gospel have implications for all of life? And we actually need to look back at Genesis 1 and 2 to see, oh, God is about cosmic creation. Therefore, he is going to be about cosmic renewal. He didn't create us in a vacuum in Eden with just us and him. He created the whole cosmos, and therefore he cares about the whole cosmos. Now, our broken relationship with God tarnishes the whole cosmos, and Jesus comes to renew that relationship, but then that has implications for the whole cosmos. And so Keller does a good job, I think, of talking about this in his book on Ministries of Mercy, our theological relationship with God, which is what I think the church should be about. The church gathered. When I'm coming on a Sunday morning, I'm telling people be reconciled to God.
Mm-hmm.
And I am giving them principles for how they might live that out. Because in the fall, our relationships get jacked up. Psychology of the person gets jacked up. Adam and Eve's marriage gets jacked up. All relationships, Cain and Abel, they kill each other, blah, blah, blah. Society gets jacked up. All kinds of organizations, marriage, any kind of social structures we would have built get jacked up. Society gets jacked up. And then fourth, Keller says the nature itself gets jacked up.
Yeah.
Created order itself is subject to futility because of our sin. So because of our relationship being reconciled to God, should not our work as the church address those things? Yes, of course. Now the question is how? How should we address it? And I think the role of the church gathered when we come together and worship is to teach the Bible. The Bible teaches us principles. And it is up to the wisdom of the church scattered, to live those principles out. That's why Derek and I are never going to tell you who to vote for. We're not going to tell you which government policy works the best. We're going to tell you, be reconciled to God. Here are some principles, but there's various wisdoms that might help you live that out. I'll give you a couple examples. We think drunkenness is a sin. To be drunk is a sin. I'll happily preach that. Social ethic. I would argue social justice issue. It's an issue that has societal components. That's what I mean by social justice. And I don't have time to get into why I think a lot of secular social justice issues are flat and there's problems with all these things. I'm just going to assume that's the case. Now, I think it would be overstepping for the church to say the government should therefore institute prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
Why? We're not the government. There's a distinction between my authority as a pastor, which is ministerial and declarative, as our Book of Church Order says, which basically means I teach you the Bible, and I help you live it out. But I think there are various ways to, overcome overcome drunkenness. Is it raising the drinking age? Sure, that could be an idea. Whatever. I just don't know. I think that having sex outside of a monogamous marriage between one man and one woman is wrong, and I will happily teach that from the pulpit. I'm not going to tell the government how to enforce that. I'm not going to say the government should therefore make that illegal. Now, I think I gave you two easy examples.
Yeah.
What about abortion? I'm going to sit and tell you, you guys should not have an abortion because that is, it's taking a human life. And totally sympathize with all of the very complex reasons and treat the mother as a person as well as the, baby in the womb. But I'm not sure that it's my role as a pastor. I have my own thoughts on it and I have my own preferences on it to tell you which political policy would help people not commit abortion.
Mm-hmm.
I have my preferences, but the thing is I won't preach them because I think when I'm getting up there to preach, I'm teaching what I believe God to say. And I'm not 100% sure what is the best strategy. I've been convinced by some, but I think, do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
That's something I've wrestled with. Like what political strategy should or would help. Now my inclination, I'll just go ahead and reveal my hand here, is that we should make it illegal. But I've heard good arguments that if you make it illegal, more people will actually do it behind the scenes. I don't know enough to know which one is the true case, but here's the thing. We should be able to teach the principle that abortion is wrong, but the political realities of my goal is how can we help as many kids stay alive as possible? And also, how can I come along and support as many mothers as possible? That's my twofold goal.
Mm-hmm.
I think adoption could help with that. I think a lot of things could help with that. I'm not smart enough politically to know what that would do. And quite frankly, maybe this is laziness. That's not my job.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not the church's job to tell you how to live that out. And so there's a lot of justice issues, poverty. We could go into that. I think the church should care for the poor. How? I don't really know. I don't know if big government or small government helps more. I think from what little I can tell, there's a lot of problems with both. And anybody that's coming along with a silver bullet is full of themselves. And this is not true. It's super complex from what I can tell. But my job is not to tell you how to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Even within creation care, the Lord calls us to care for creation. Now, should we cut emission gases and all this? I don't know. There are various ways to do that. I think we should consume less to begin with. That's, in my opinion, the best creation care strategy. Instead of saying which clothes are ethically viable, maybe stop buying so many clothes. But anyway, I'm digressing. But I say all that to say that I think part of the problem is the church should teach the principle and the primary relationship about church gathered should do that. And then the church scattered should go forth and fight evil in their respective spheres. And there should be a healthy level of diversity of opinion on not the principles. No one should be debating whether drunkenness is wrong. Nobody should be debating between marriage between one man and one woman should be wrong. Nobody should be debating abortion is wrong. We should have the ability to debate what's the best way to live this out in a fallen world. Because the world is fallen, all these things are super complex. And that's the role of the church scattered. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I don't know. Any pushback to that? Any clarity? I don't know.
I would say, I guess, you don't want to take the approach of, well, I don't know the best solution to be an excuse to not engage with those things.
That's a great point. Yeah. And I think that's where the church should be very clear about the principles. And then it's almost like the church gathered at least, meaning pastors and whatever, should then they should basically take a seat and have a dialogue with everyone about what might be the best way. But then even the Bible, I think, does give us wisdom for the how to some of these things, but it's really tough to say the Bible tells us that a small government is better than a big government. This sounds relativistic, but I would almost wager to say that it depends on the context. To whereas a big government might work in in Scotland better than it might work here in America.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because I'm a small government person, but I'm not going to enforce that view on other people. Anyway.
Yeah.
We're maybe getting into contentious waters, but I do think that's just a framework of church scattered, church gathered. And then also just kind of emphasizing the primacy of Jesus's mission to renew all things, but then seeing, by renewing our relationship with God, Jesus is bringing cosmic renewal through that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
We're in an hour.
We're in an hour. I think
we covered a lot of ground, though.
We did. I think some good stuff there. And yeah, we'll see everyone next week. Continue to send in your questions. And
next week is Sabbath, so we're gonna have fun.
Ooh.
I'm gonna get a little feisty and basically be like, everybody, you need to just chill out and rest. And that's the great thing. Anyway, so we'll see if people push back.
I do remember Derek saying one funny, you know what? I almost don't want to go into it because I might get you going for too long, but
I won't respond.
Derek was talking about when he was going through the process of ordination, and they asked him about playing basketball. He said, like, oh yeah, I'm playing basketball with my kids on the Sabbath. And they asked him, do you keep score? And he was like, are we being a little pharisaical here on
He could have roasted his kid there and been like, no, it didn't count as work because it was so easy.
Yeah. There you go.
Anyway.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We will see you next week.
Awesome. See you guys. All right. What am I supposed to say? Oh, yeah. Peace.
Peace.